So online there's a lot of debate about hardware versus plugins, but really in the world that we live in now in recording and music production, the truth is that neither are better than the other. Really, they're just different tools. Whether we're using software or hardware, plugins and hardware alike, they're just tools that we have at our disposal. And the question you should always be asking yourself is, what is the right tool for this job? So today we're going to have a look at the different times that might be best to use hardware and the other times where software and plugins might be the better tool to reach for. So you should all know on this channel, I love hardware. I love building DIY kits of microphones, preamps, compressors, EQs, all that good stuff. And I love using hardware. I love mixing and recording with it. However, it's not always the best tool for the job, and that's okay. But the times that I do reach for hardware are, number one, in tracking. When I'm recording, I am always running everything I possibly can through a piece of hardware. So microphones are going to go into vintage hardware preamps like my Neves, APIs, or any of the other bits of outboard gear that I have. They're also going to run into EQs and compressors where applicable. Things like vocals, I will process vocals as much as is possible or relevant to the type of vocal I'm trying to capture. And that's because of two reasons. First of all, the artist gets a better representation in their headphones immediately as they are performing when running through hardware with all of that analog processing going on in real time. A singer will get a much clearer version of their vocal if it's equalized and compressed in their headphones. And the added benefit of this is you actually often get a better performance. When recording vocalists and using compression in real time in tracking, they can also push into that compressor and get a bit more energy and mojo as that compressor gives them something back. It's a interesting kind of hard to quantify kind of thing that goes on in a recording session, but it's very different from when you record without processing. So I always use hardware as much as possible in tracking. Number two, the other reason why I use hardware in tracking, it means that I can get a much more polished result during the tracking phase, and then in mixing, I have to do a lot less to make the song sound finished. And look, I was taught at uni not to process signals when recording, and I think that was probably one of the worst things I was ever taught when I studied, because you know what? We're all going to make mistakes when we first use hardware and we first compress a vocal in real time in a tracking situation. However, you will learn from those mistakes. So if you're afraid of putting some EQ and some compression on during a recording session, don't be. Go for it. Make those mistakes and then learn from them. Now, the other time I'd be using hardware is during the mixing phase. However, because of what I spoke about earlier, I probably don't need to do hardware processing on everything. If I've already processed vocals and some of the drums and stuff through hardware on the way in when tracking, I might only need some gentle compression and things like bus processing on stuff like drums or adding compression and effects on some background vocals. Now, that's not to say that I can't or I won't do further analog processing, but it is time consuming because you have to then send that signal back out through your hardware and reprint it back into your session. And that can be a time consuming process, especially when you've got a high track count. So generally in mixing, I would do my editing phase. Then I would do a bit of bus processing or some hardware stuff on certain tracks, especially tracks that need a bit of extra mojo or color or flavor that I just can't get from plugins. The final time that I would put any kind of hardware processing on a mix or a master is at the final stages in the final mixdown or the final mastering of a track. I might run a track as a mix or a master through specific hardware to give it just that extra oomph in the final mixdown stage. Stuff like bus compression, using things like SSLG bus compressors or other stereo pairs of compressors is a good one. Maybe EQ, but generally I would save that for plugins. And definitely with limiting, I'm going to leave that for plugins as well. Not only because I don't own a hardware limiter at all, but because it might be something I have to recall later on. So I try and limit how much I'm doing in the final stages with hardware. So they're the stages of a production that I would use hardware in tracking, mixing, and final mix and mastering. However, there's some gaps in that process. So when would I then use plugins? Well, I'm going to use plugins whenever I can't use hardware. So in tracking, I would typically use plugins for reverb. I don't have any hardware reverbs in the studio yet. Definitely might be looking at some reverb units in hardware form, but for now I just use plugins. So when I'm tracking and the artist wants a bit of reverb on their vocals, I'm going to reach for a plugin. That's quick, easy. I can manipulate it nice and easy. I don't have to stuff around. Boom, there we go. And honestly, in most of my template sessions, I have reverbs loaded up. So it's one of those often occasions where a plugin is better because you can have it templated in a session. So on that, I'll often use plugins when they're templated in my session for various effects. Any session I open for different genres will have plugins on certain tracks and certain groups and certain buses, and those will be preloaded but maybe bypassed, and then they're ready to go so I can move quickly through a session without having to search for plugins for specific things. One of the absolute musts for me is with Autotune. If I have a vocalist that wants to do Autotune style vocals in tracking or mixing, I'm gonna reach for a plugin. I don't have a hardware Autotune. Who does? So that is an absolute must for me for plugins is with Autotune. One of the other times that I'll definitely use plugins is when an artist needs a job done quickly. If I've got an artist that is really tight on their budget or really tight on a time frame for when a production needs to be completed, I will obviously reach for more plugins because it is faster and I don't have to keep printing tracks to get all that processing back in the box. And then on top of that, as I said before, I've got templated sessions where I can just open up those plugins that I've preloaded and get mixing much, much quicker than fiddling with dials. Because if I have an artist that's doing an attended session sitting with me here in the studio, they don't want to see me fucking about with EQ dials and hardware and trying to get a sound. They just want to see me quickly and efficiently mix their track and make it sound good. And they definitely don't want to sit on the couch and watch the screen printing tracks in, especially if it's a long song. That can be mind-numbingly boring for the artist, and it can seem like you're not really doing much, even though they know it's part of the process. So it's a tricky thing to balance with the artist expectations, but if I need to move fast and I have a strict budget or time frame, definitely plugins are the more useful tool. Now, the final step where I would use plugins is anywhere where I'm going to need to bring up a session in Recall and recall the settings for things like artist revisions. So if an artist wants to go home, listen to stuff, and then come back to me with some revisions and some slight tweaks and changes to their mix or master, I'm definitely going to then be focusing on plugins for those sessions. Some artists want to finish the song here and then just leave and then they're done. And those sessions, I can gladly use hardware on the mix buses, master buses, all that kind of stuff. But if it's an artist that's going to want changes, this is something that I might sort out with them earlier in the production phase, but then I would definitely be sticking mostly, if not entirely, to plugins. So that's just my procedure. I love this hybrid world we live in. I love having hardware tools at my disposal. They're really cool, they're really fun. Artists can enjoy it too, but I also like plugins. There are many use cases to use plugins, and there's many times when a plugin is the right choice. But that's just my process. What do you guys think? What plugins do you use, or when do you opt for hardware or plugins? Have I left anything out? Hit me up in those comment sections down below and let me know. What's your workflow? What do you use? And how do you like to use plugins or hardware or a hybrid system of both? Hopefully this information was really useful to you guys. As always, don't forget to hit subscribe. I'm Mitch from the DIYrecordingstudio.com. I'll catch you soon.